Welcome back. In Act One, we saw the close of the American frontier, an immigrant wave, the new uses of social science and politics, a free market economic boom, and America's worst economic crisis. It would get worse before it got better. Like so much that transpired in America in the 20th century, World War II was at its root about liberty, preserving it, defending it, reinstating it, expanding it around the world where it was directly threatened and in America where it was not. Let's pick up the story. As the 1940s began, America was still struggling to emerge from a depression that had already stretched to a full decade. The New Deal programs may well have cushioned the blow, but did not end the crisis, not by a long shot. Nonetheless, the American people continue to display a characteristic optimism. A Roper poll for Fortune magazine showed that 71% of respondents thought the country would return to an era of expansion and opportunity. But many intellectuals were much more pessimistic.
Just as an earlier generation of Americans at the end of the 19th century had thought that the closing of the frontier, the end of the frontier, had closed a major chapter in American history, so too did many people in the 1930s think that the Depression marked the end of an economic era, the end of an era of growth. The economy had matured, was the way that they described it, and they thought it was not very likely that it would ever again grow at the rate that it had for the preceding century or so.
But then something happened. $16 million Americans went off to fight, 1 out of every 9 Americans. 400,000 of them would lose their lives. Worldwide, 80 million people were killed. But for America, the Second World War was also an engine of huge social and economic change for the better.
It's kind of a terrible irony, in a way, that the solution to America's problems was World War II.
The war did what all the New Deal programs of the 1930s had failed to do: end the Depression. Factories long idle, plants running at a fraction of capacity, now geared up for flat-out wartime production. At its peak, the United States rolled out a ship every day and an airplane every 5 minutes. All that production put money in people's pockets. Suddenly, everyone was working. In 1938, the unemployment rate was 19%. In 1944, it was 1%.
Except for those who served in battle, the war was probably the best thing that had happened to the American people in the 20th century. For those at home, it meant unprecedented prosperity. Income levels had never been as high at any point in history before that time.
We were the only belligerent country, the only country that fought World War II, that managed to increase its standard of living, its civilian standard of living, even while it was fighting the war. In this country, we had more guns and more butter, too.
The war set people in motion. Defense plants in the industrial North and Far West became magnets for huge migrations of job seekers from the South and East. From 1940 to 1950, 8 million people moved to the West Coast, the largest westward migration in American history.
One historian has described it as it's as if some great hand reached down and tipped the whole continent westward, and people just slid, especially from the Midwest and the South, to the West Coast, which nearly doubled its population in the war. You might say the war was a kind of demographic cauldron in which the American people were churned as they hadn't been probably for 100 years since they first burst across the Appalachian crest in the early 19th century.
The wartime demand for labor bowled over some long-standing barriers. In a wartime address, President Roosevelt said this:
"In some communities, employers dislike to employ women. In others, they are reluctant to hire Negroes. We can no longer afford to indulge such prejudices or practices."
On the eve of World War II, 3 out of 4 African Americans still lived in the South, the poorest people in the nation's poorest region. Nationally, they were more likely than whites to work in unskilled jobs for lower pay, 39% of what whites earned. By today's standards, almost 9 out of 10 were below the federal poverty threshold. And due to Jim Crow segregation laws, less than 5% of eligible blacks in states of the old Confederacy could vote. At first, it looked like the war wouldn't change much of that. At the beginning, blacks were excluded from the Army Air Corps and the Marines. In the Navy, they could only serve as kitchen staff. The Army accepted blacks, but they could only serve in segregated units commanded by white officers. Many defense plants did not want to hire blacks. But in 1941, A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened to have 100,000 blacks march on Washington to protest job discrimination.
The very idea of having a march on Washington during the war was really a very important symbolic change in the way that blacks were addressing the problems of race in America.
President Roosevelt yielded to Randolph's demand. He issued Executive Order 8802, prohibiting discrimination in defense jobs or government. The lure of well-paid jobs pulled blacks out of the South and into the war plants in the North and West. 700,000 blacks during the course of the war. In the peak year of 1943, 10,000 blacks per month arrived in Los Angeles alone. Black women who had earned $3.50 a week as domestic servants back in the South found themselves making $48 a week in the aircraft plants of Los Angeles. By the war's end, African Americans held almost 8% of all defense industry jobs, not far from their proportion of the total population. The number of blacks working for the federal government more than tripled.
What it meant was that blacks gradually developed a working class population. Prior to this time, they were overwhelmingly impoverished. But after World War II, you saw the gradual development of a black working class. And so the entry into these goods-producing industries was a stepping stone into higher status.
The gains were not just economic. When blacks migrated seeking better jobs, they left the Jim Crow South far behind.
Blacks now moved to places in the country where they could vote, which they could not do in any appreciable numbers in the segregated pre-World War II South.
The war's impact on blacks is reflected in the numbers. Between 1940 and 1950, the black population of Mississippi went down by 8%. The black population of Michigan went up by 112%. California, up 272%. In 1939, black males earned 41% of what white males earned. In 1947, they earned 54% of what white males earned. The war also created new opportunities for women, now desperately needed to keep defense plants running. Today, most of us are familiar with the story of Rosie the Riveter. Anecdotal histories and government propaganda have made Rosie the symbol of wartime working women.
On the day long, whether rain or shine. She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie, the Riveter.
But just how typical was Rosie?
The Rosie the Riveter image was an exaggerated image. It was typical of a few women, and it was perhaps how most women imagined themselves, even as they were doing dreary work. But in fact, it was an exaggerated image.
Rosie, 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 working on assembly line.
The numbers give a sense of proportion. Nearly 2 million women worked in defense plants during the war, 500,000 in the aircraft industry alone. 225,000 women worked in shipbuilding. That's a lot. But these women never made up more than 10% of the total female workforce of 19 million.
If you look at the whole distribution of what women were doing in wartime, you might say the typical woman war worker should be called Sally the secretary, or in fact maybe even Molly the mom, because most women persisted in their traditional functions during the war.
The biggest difference was in who those working women were. Before the war, women who worked were typically young and single. That began to change. Thanks to the wartime labor shortage, working women were more likely to be middle-aged and married. In 1940, 36% of working women were married. In 1944, 46% were married. In 1940, 43% of working women were 35 or older. By 1944, that number had jumped to 62%. World War II had one other very significant benefit for the United States.
When the war ends, the United States is the only first-class economy left in the world. It's the only one. And it retains that position for 10, 15 years after the war. So you couldn't ask for a better start to peacetime for Americans.
Goodbye to the Army for these G.I. Joes at Fort Dix, New Jersey.
1945, World War II ended. Johnny came marching home again. The GIs invaded America. But beneath the homecomings and the hoopla, there was deep concern. What would happen to those 10 million veterans now returning to civilian life? Even as the war raged, government planners had gloomy visions of millions of vets standing in depression-scale unemployment lines. Then in March of 1944, Congress passed and the President signed a critical piece of legislation.
In the presence of senators, congressmen, and the heads of veterans organizations, President Roosevelt signs G.I. Joe's Bill of Rights.
The GI Bill, ironically, was originally conceived as a way to ease the transition of demobilized veterans back into the economy, because many people feared that the Depression of the 30s would return after the war. So some device had to be found to slow down the return to the workforce of these veterans. But ironically, the way the GI Bill actually played out was a tremendous bonus to their skill level, their educational level, which in turn fueled the productivity of the economy in the post-war era.
Almost 8 million veterans received educational benefits via the GI Bill. Many went to trade schools or job training, and more than 2 million went to college. From 1930 to 1950, the number of college degrees granted in America went up 3.5 times, from 122,000 to 432,000.
Most of them at the time regarded this as 3 lost years, just taken away. And so instead of doing things in sequence, they did them all at once. They went to college, became engaged, got married, and started having children all at the same time.
With their new wives and newer families, veterans arrived on college campuses in overwhelming numbers. At the University of Minnesota in 1947, Of 30,000 students, 60% were veterans, and a third of those were married. At colleges across the country, married vets lived in on-campus housing with names like Vetsburg or Fertile Acres. Much of the veterans' housing was makeshift military, but the company they kept in their new barracks was clearly an improvement. In college or out, veterans were marrying and starting families. In 1946, there were almost half again as many marriages as in 1940, which led very quickly to the baby boom. Just 9 months after demobilization, the number of births began to soar to 2.9 million per year and kept on soaring. Demographers had expected a baby boom when the wartime separations ended, but this one just didn't stop. The Energizer Bunny just kept going and going and going. Over the course of 18 years, from 1946 to 1964, 76 million American babies were born. At its peak in 1957, a dozen years after the war, the total fertility rate topped out at 3.8 children per woman. That's higher than the current rate in the less developed third world countries. The baby boom was monumental, but it was more than just an event. It is a process that will take 100 years to play out, from cradle to grave. In the years immediately following the war, the baby boom posed a problem. Where would all those growing families live? For 15 years, thanks to the Depression and World War II, there had been virtually no new housing built in the United States.
So that by 1947, you have millions of husbands and wives and children living together, bunched up, crunched in with their in-laws. That was my situation. 4 kids. I remember sleeping in a dining room. People were taking any kind of a place that had a roof over it and a wall around it as a place to live.
Today, the ingenious veteran who has managed to find even a barge or a houseboat for his family may count himself lucky, despite the special problems involved in commuting.
I think that we have never experienced in American history the kind of pent-up demand for housing that existed about 1947, 1948.
Again, the GI Bill was a key part of the solution. It allowed veterans to buy a home with no money down. What's more, it guaranteed the loans, removing the risk for lenders. In a housing boom to end all housing booms, builders responded. Lakewood, California, 15 miles south of Los Angeles. In 1950, this was called the fastest growing housing development in the world. On one day, 100 homes were sold in 1 hour. Builders here started 50 houses a day. Cement trucks waited in a mile-long line to pour foundations for low-cost housing. Within just 3 years, the empty farmland around Lakewood had grown to a city of 90,000 people. Nationwide, housing starts soared from a low of only 1 per 1,000 people in the war year of 1944 to a high of 12 per 1,000 in 1950, a number not equaled since. By 1950, the same assembly line methods that had turned out an airplane every 5 minutes during the war were used to build almost 4 new houses per minute.
We are making on the order of 2 million houses, new starts per year, and about 95% of them are fully detached single-family houses. The second thing to remember about it is they're affordable. Quite literally, you could buy a house in the 1950s cheaper than you could rent it. In some ways, if we look at the whole history of the world, what's been unusual about America, the United States, has been that the single-family house has been available and affordable to the average person. more so than in any other land save possibly Australia and Canada.
In 1940, only 2 Americans in 5 owned their own homes. By 1950, it was more than half, and by the end of the 1950s boom, home ownership had climbed to 61%. Today, 2 out of every 3 Americans own their own homes. Increasingly, those homes are in the suburbs. 12% in 1910, about a third in 1960, and today a majority of Americans live in the suburbs.
You have sort of a national ethos that celebrates the single-family house. We believe in it. We're not like, let's say, the Spanish or the Italians or the Germans or the Japanese who love urban life. It's not surprising that we become essentially the world's greatest suburban nation.
This, too, was liberty and individualism at work, a freestanding private home of your own on land that you own. Now, these days, suburbia has its critics. It's sprawl, they say. But hey, have you ever heard anyone say, a man's apartment is his castle? In the years following the war, there were also criticisms of the suburbs and of the people who lived in them. The book, The Crack in the Picture Window by John Keats, was somewhat typical, complaining that the suburbs were boring places with no culture, where a homogeneous group of conformists lived in ticky-tacky homes, one looking exactly like the other. The American people were not buying the criticisms. They were voting with their feet, moving to the suburbs.
This is probably the stupidest vein of social criticism ever developed in the history of social criticism, so far as I can tell, because who are they talking about? They are talking about the greatest generation. The guys who won World War II were the ones who are buying these houses and living in the subdivisions. They're the same people. So how can they be cowering conformists and people lacking any convictions of their own? In one decade, in the earlier decade, they're the greatest generation. No, they're the same people. And they have the same aspirations that Americans have always had.
And what, pray tell, were the American people doing in those homes? Today, if you want to know about sex in America, and even if you don't, the information is hard to avoid. Just look at the magazines at any newsstand or supermarket checkout line, and you will find intimate sexual behavior examined in great detail. And so too, of course, on television. Yet, not long ago, such public discussion and display of sex was limited. The naked truth about how Americans behaved was unknown. It was the last dark frontier of social science until a controversial Midwestern biology professor named Alfred Kinsey walked into America's bedroom and snapped on the light.
Ooh, Dr. Kinsey. Ooh, Dr. Kinsey.
Few books have had greater impact on American society than the 2 volumes written by Alfred Kinsey. Sexual Behavior in the Human Male hit the bookstores in 1948, selling 250,000 copies in the first year alone. Sexual Behavior in the Human Female was published in 1953. Together, they comprised the first major scientific study of American sexuality, containing data from interviews with 5,300 men and 5,900 women, covering most every aspect of their sexual histories.
What happens when Kinsey publishes the male volume and the female volume is that American society gets permission to talk about sex. You can go in boardrooms, you can go in barbershops, you can go in cafes, you can go on sidewalks, street corners, and people are talking about issues that they never would have talked about before. Alfred Kinsey says X number of people masturbate. Alfred Kinsey says X number of men have premarital intercourse. And people have permission, really, by science, the great secular force in our society, to open these questions to discussion.
Some readers were shocked, others comforted. Some attacked the accuracy of the data. For according to Kinsey, there was a wide gap between what people thought was normal and what people were actually doing.
Since I've read your report, I'm disillusioned as can be.
For example, premarital sex was reported by 2 out of every 3 college-educated males and almost all males with only a grade school education. More surprisingly, about half of all females said they had sex before marriage. What about extramarital sex? Kinsey maintained that about half of all married males and 1/4 of married females had strayed from the marital bed at some point in their lives. The data on male homosexuality was most shocking and immediately challenged. Kinsey reported that 37% of males had at least one homosexual experience to the point of orgasm. What's more, 10% of males in the sample were predominantly homosexual for at least 3 years. About 4% were said to be exclusively homosexual for life. The 2 books made Kinsey an international celebrity, both praised and vilified. Some regarded the works as a clarion call for personal liberation. Others saw them as precursors of promiscuity. Publicly, Kinsey always maintained that he had no social agenda and that what drove him was science for science's sake.
Pure research depends upon the sort of objectivity which gathers data and allows other people to use those data.
But as more has come to be known about the private Kinsey and his passions, both social and sexual, it has become clear that there was more to Kinsey than his scientific stance.
Kinsey is at odds with the way society regulates human sexual behavior. And what he wants to see is a much more encompassing ethic of tolerance that will make a room at the table for lots of different kinds of people who don't fit under the cookie cutters of prescribed morality.
You know, he was trying to make the world a more tolerant and happier place. But you'd never get him to admit that.
Kinsey was born in 1894 in New Jersey, where he grew up under the stern guidance of a very religious father.
Yeah, you got the impression that everything connected with sex was dangerous and sinful, and so he suffered a great deal as a child. You know, he thought if his masturbation would drive him insane, or stunt his growth, or that he'd go to hell because of it, you know, that kind of business. And he often said, I'd like to see it that no child ever went through this nonsense that I had to go through.
Kinsey was probably motivated by his adult sex life as well. He remained happily married to his wife Clara to the end of his life. But over the years, he also had sexual relations with men and engaged in sadomasochism.
Kinsey's private life was at odds with his public persona. Publicly, Kinsey presented the image of a very staid Midwest university professor, family man. Privately, he's also a person who pushes the envelope with regard to experimentation with behavior.
Kinsey's research methods went beyond interviewing. He and a photographer filmed various animals copulating. Less openly, in the privacy of the attic of his own home, Kinsey filmed human sexual behavior, including masturbation, hetero and homosexual intercourse, and sadomasochism.
We tried to anticipate Masters and Johnson a little bit. For example, if we could have someone masturbating or in sexual intercourse, you know, maybe one of us would be trying to hold a finger on their pulse to count the pulse, and somebody else might be trying to count the respiration. That was very primitive. It's all we could do. And so instead of, these weren't exactly orgies, some of these were pretty medically inclined.
The sessions involved members of Kinsey's team and their wives, trusted volunteers, and occasionally Kinsey himself. Kinsey's wife, Clara, made the participants feel right at home.
Images I have of Clara that's really, quite sweet is that people will be involved in the attic with all kinds of sexual acts, and she'll come in with milk and cookies and towels for them to, dry off and freshen up, and then milk and cookies, and then the next round of, behavior will begin.
But even if the private Kinsey was a sexual experimenter and a covert crusader for what he considered sexual tolerance, the key questions remain. Does it matter? Did it lead him to slant his data?
Kinsey would never, it's just not part of his makeup, would never have knowingly doctored the books. With Kinsey, though, his desire to change attitudes, to have people be tolerant, is something that shapes his writing. It's something that really molds his presentation of data.
Case in point, the data on homosexuality. Kinsey reported what he found, but his sample included adolescent boys who engaged in group masturbation.
No, a lot of this came about in the early post-puberty. So yeah, for 3 years in there, they were much more homosexual than heterosexual. And Kinsey had just put that out as a kind of to emphasize what he felt, was to show the degree to which homosexuality was prevalent.
There were also problems with Kinsey's statistical procedures. His methodology was derived from his previous biological fieldwork on the gall wasp. Kinsey had roamed far and wide across the United States and Central America collecting tens of thousands of samples of the wasps.
He takes that same approach of huge samples, vast geographical expanses, a dogged pursuit of every specimen that he can locate, and he just transfers it bodily to the study of human sexual behavior, never doubting that if he collects enough and does it in enough different places, he'll put together a portrait of human sexuality that starts to look like the truth.
And so Kinsey and his team crisscrossed America, from California to the Carolinas, from campus co-eds to gay hustlers and prostitutes in Times Square. He interviewed many prisoners, including sex offenders at San Quentin, whose incidence of homosexuality was substantially higher than average. As a means of portraying the vast range of human sexual behavior, Kinsey's approach was fine, but it was less useful in generalizing about the population as a whole.
In the first book, Kinsey made an attempt to generalize, to extrapolate to the general population, and he realized later that was a mistake. He changed his mind, and he decided, we'll not do that.
How have Kinsey's results held up? After the male volume was released, the American Statistical Association sent a blue ribbon panel to Bloomington to examine the data. They had criticisms, but their report was largely favorable. In later years, a reanalysis of Kinsey's data by researchers John Gagnon and William Simon reported that some of the percentages on homosexuality were overstated and not representative of the American public as a whole. Kinsey had oversampled prison populations and included teenage incidents. His exclusively homosexual calculation, however, was not far off the mark, according to Gagnon and Simon, whose estimate is 3% as opposed to Kinsey's 4%. Kinsey's data may forever remain controversial, but whatever the debate over his statistics, there is no denying the tremendous impact that Alfred Kinsey had on America at mid-century.
When we talk about Kinsey's validity, the numbers to me are less important than the impact of the work as a piece of social reform. I think Kinsey's work precipitates the most sustained and the highest level discussion of human sexuality up to that point in American history. And out of that discussion will come a review of social policy, will come a review of sex offender codes, will come a review of gender roles, will come a review of the place of gays in American society. And to the extent that Kinsey forces the public to reevaluate and to accept science as an arbiter of these issues, to that extent, he changes American society.
Has sexual behavior changed since Kinsey? Premarital sex up. It's estimated that 3 out of 4 women have had sex before marriage. Extramarital sex down. Kinsey reported 50% of men and 26% of women, but that included couples separated by the war. The numbers in the 1990s were 25% of men and 15% of women. Homosexuality? No real change. Kinsey estimated the range at 3 to 6% of men and 3 to 8% of women. The 1990 data, 3 to 5% of men and roughly 4% of women. Over the course of the century, American women had been gradually moving into the workforce. At the height of World War II, Norman Rockwell captured the spirit of America's working women with this robust take on an American icon, Rosie the Riveter. After the war, Rosie the Riveter, Sally the Secretary, and many others went back home. But soon women would return to work in larger numbers than ever before, and America would never be the same.
I think the wartime experience had an impact on women. It raised expectations of what life could be like. It made it possible for them to imagine dual roles, both inside the home and outside the home. It made it possible for them to imagine a kind of economic independence that was less possible before the war.
Most middle-class women in the 1950s and early 1960s were living comfortable lives, certainly by most any previous measurable standards, certainly in America's thriving suburbs. But not everyone was fully satisfied with this leafy suburban utopia. One housewife tapped into the unease about what she called the problem that has no name. Betty Friedan was born in Peoria, Illinois in 1921 and attended Smith College. Friedan became a liberal activist and later married and moved to the suburbs to raise a family. A working mother, Friedan wrote freelance articles for women's magazines extolling the typical 1950s family. To mark the 15th reunion of her fellow Smith graduates, Friedan conducted a survey of their attitudes and accomplishments. Some 200 of her classmates responded.
The questionnaire was quite interesting, and it raised more questions than it answered, but it showed that with all the education, American women were frustrated in just the role of housewife, but they also managed to enlarge it.
The survey, along with Friedan's interviews of suburban women, eventually became the basis for her book, The Feminine Mystique. Friedan criticized how she felt society discouraged women from making careers away from home and family. Friedan called suburban homes comfortable concentration camps.
It is urgent to understand how the very condition of being a housewife can create a sense of emptiness, non-existence, nothingness in women. For women of ability in America today, I am convinced there is something about the housewife state that is dangerous.
Although there has been some criticism of what Friedan's survey actually found, her critique struck a chord. The Feminine Mystique sold nearly 3 million copies in its first 3 years in print. Its publication is often regarded as the beginning of the modern women's movement.
When this book comes, it comes at exactly the right moment to in some way start a grass fire across suburban America in which women say, I recognize myself there. I'm one of those people who's not that happy.
First step in revolution is consciousness. Well, I did the consciousness with the Feminine Mystique.
Let's take a look at the lay of the land before and after the modern women's movement. The role of women had been changing quite dramatically throughout the century. But after the new round of activism that began in the mid-1960s, many of those trends continued and some went into overdrive. The percentage of women on college campuses, though lower than that for men, had been increasing from 1900 to 1940. World War II temporarily halted this progress, but by 1965, the trend resumed its rise. By the 1980s, more women than men were earning college degrees. And what was happening to these better educated women? Most went into the workplace. The percentage of married women in the labor force had been steadily increasing for the entire century. After the turbulence of World War II subsided, that rate kept on soaring, reaching 36% in 1965 and 61% in 1998, although many women worked part-time. The proportion of professional women has skyrocketed. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, up big. Earnings for women working full-time year-round as compared to men took off around 1980, climbing from about 60% to almost 75% in 1997. When gender and wages are further corrected for work experience, education, and time on job, the earnings gap shrinks far further, very close to equality. In 1960, almost 70 years after Frederick Jackson Turner noted the closing of the old frontier, President John F. Kennedy sounded the trumpet for a new frontier. Things seemed fine. The post-war American economy was growing, strong and steady. The old pattern of boom and bust had softened. But things were about to change. Murphy's Law was in the saddle. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong at the worst possible time. Soon, Americans faced grave problems, cultural, social, and economic. Growth of the gross domestic product is one measure of America's economic health, and during the first half of the 20th century, it had swung wildly, indicating a painful pattern of economic boom and bust. From mid-century on, that line would stabilize at positive levels. But in the early 1960s, clearly, not everyone was sharing in the good times. A young writer named Michael Harrington challenged the notion of post-war affluence. In his 1962 book, The Other America, Harrington estimated, and perhaps overestimated, that 25% of the country, between 40 and 50 million people, lived in poverty, invisible to their more prosperous fellow citizens. The book influenced what came to be called the War on Poverty.
Let this session of Congress be known as the session which declared all-out war on human poverty and unemployment in these United States.
But it was not to be an easy war, and there was more to poverty than just a lack of money. In 1965, a young academic in the Johnson administration began a serious study of how culture and economics were intertwined. Daniel Patrick Moynihan examined the data and wrote, "The Negro Family, the Case for National Action." The report, published by the Department of Labor, used data to focus attention on the problems of black families.
These are accurate statistics, most of them government statistics. Most of them are available if you dig through those census volumes. The issue is, what are we going to do about these facts?
Scouring Labor Department statistics, Moynihan found, unsurprisingly, that when unemployment went up, more people went on welfare, and vice versa. This correlation seemed to be set in stone. But Moynihan noticed that something was changing.
In 1963, that correlation had disappeared. Suddenly, the unemployment rate for minorities as well as everybody else, was going down, and the dependency rate, if you want to put it that way, was going up. Now, what was this all about?
According to Moynihan, at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family.
It seems to me that there are a great many Negro Americans, perhaps half the population, is securely in the middle class, doing very well, taking care of itself, needing no help from anybody, thank you very much. But the slums are also filling up with a lower class people, unemployed, ill-educated, ill-housed, for whom the cycle of no jobs and bad education and bad housing just reproduces itself in and takes its most poignant personal form in the great tragedy of the family lives of these men and women and of their children.
The Moynihan Report takes up the question of what would be necessary to bring African Americans more fully into a status of equal opportunity in American society, and argues that a major impediment would be that the family structure among blacks was weaker and was becoming a major problem.
Out-of-wedlock births among blacks had gone up from 17% in 1950 to 26% in 1965. By 1970, that figure would reach 39%. More children were being raised without the presence of fathers.
At any given moment, two-thirds of the Negro families are husband-wife families, but over the lifetime, only about a little more than a third of Negro children come of 18 having lived all their lives in such a family. And that hurts people. That deprives them of opportunities, not to have a father, not to have a mother. You've lost something that helps you in life. And so this process feeds back into the cycle.
For Moynihan, the issue was more than just one of dry social science. From the age of 9, he had been raised in a single-parent home.
It was his view, a man who grew up in a female-headed, single-parent family, quite sensitive to this issue, that without an intact family, the problems of manhood, of establishing true manliness among some black Americans, would prove to be very difficult, possibly insoluble.
Moynihan's argument convinced his boss, President Lyndon Johnson.
Perhaps most important, its influence radiating to every part of life is the breakdown of the Negro family structure. And when the family collapses, it is the children that are usually damaged.
The Moynihan Report stirred the pot. Was the erosion of the black family the consequence of a culture that was broken, or of discrimination, or of an economy that could not produce enough good jobs?
What Moynihan did was to notice that perhaps the family itself ought to be addressed as an explicit issue for social policy and not simply the economic issue of having enough jobs and opportunities.
Opportunities had been growing for blacks during the 1960s. Civil rights legislation killed Jim Crow. The black poverty rate declined, and the black middle class grew. To many civil rights leaders, Moynihan's views were heresy.
We had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had been enacted, a great victory for the civil rights movement. We had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing African Americans fully in to the body politic. Now, along comes someone who says, yes, hold on, but wait just a minute. Have you noticed these social trends?
Now, the reaction, of course, was Moynihan is blaming the victim. The inundation of criticism of him in the early 1960s was ferocious.
The interesting thing is that if one considers the Moynihan Report about the breakdown of the Negro community, one is to look back to the Irish and to the Italian experience, which is very simple. That as the heads of families were permitted by this society to have economic independence, all of the so-called defects of crime, illegitimacy, and the like disappeared.
Another key study of the time looked at the importance of the family, this time in relation to education. Sociologist James Coleman's report was called Equality of Educational Opportunity. It had been mandated by the 1964 Civil Rights Act to study the effects of school segregation.
Coleman had two big expectations when he did his report. He thought he was going to find that the schools that black children attended got far less adequate resources than the schools that white children attended, and he thought that he was going to find that the resources that schools got made a big difference to student achievement.
To test these theories, Coleman and his researchers surveyed over 600,000 students and 4,000 schools. It was one of the largest social science projects ever undertaken. Working day and night on a tight deadline, holed up in a hotel room, Coleman and his team crunched the numbers.
This was really a mammoth undertaking. The number of social scientists living today who could claim to have ever written a major piece of work in 3 months is extremely small. In fact, it may be zero other than Jim Coleman.
By looking at the numbers, Coleman ended up challenging conventional wisdom as well as his own previous views.
Early one evening, there's a reception at the Harvard Faculty Club. And Seymour Martin Lipset, the incomparable Marty Lipset, walks in, sees me, comes over and says, "You know what Coleman's finding, don't you?" And I said, "No." He said, "It's all family."
The Coleman report pointed to the family as the most important indicator by far of how a child would perform at school. And since the Moynihan and Coleman reports were published, the American family, black and white, continued to change, but not necessarily for the better.
I think today most social scientists would agree with Moynihan's view that single-parent families really have adverse effects on children, and that this contributed to the problems of African American communities in the 1960s and since, but also now to the problems of Latino and white and other communities.
Not only did black out-of-wedlock birth rates skyrocket, but so did white rates. In fact, by 1999, the white illegitimacy rate was equal to the black rate when the Moynihan report was written. And black out-of-wedlock births reached almost 70%. But there is some good news. The teenage birth rate is down. This may well lead to lower out-of-wedlock birth rates in the future.
If we ask the question today of how the Moynihan report looks, now we look back 35 years later, I'd have to say it's looking pretty good. A fairly prescient piece of social forecasting would, I think, have to be a fair-minded person's judgment. I wish I could produce a document that would look as good 35 years from now.
Out-of-wedlock births were not the only problem. Social scientist Francis Fukuyama has called the phenomenon the Great Disruption.
I think that in many ways a lot of the problems that occurred during the Great Disruption were the result of a much too expansive sense of individual entitlement and almost total absence of responsibility for your spouse, for your children, for your neighbor, country, all of the communities in which we're embedded.
And we can measure that disruption. Here's just a sample. The nature of the family was changing. In the 1960s, divorce rates spiked. Once it was rare and called living in sin. The number of men and women living together without the benefit of marriage went up sixfold between 1960 and 1970, and then another sixfold between 1970 and 1998. Today, about half of all those getting married have lived in a cohabiting relationship. A third disruption concerned drugs. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the use of marijuana increased by over 400%, mind-altering hallucinogens by over 800%, cocaine 2,300%. The worst part of the Great Disruption was crime. Pat Moynihan warned that if more children grew up without the presence of fathers, the result would be social chaos, including crime. Crime rates soared, and crime and punishment became one of the most important issues in American life. During the 1960s, decline and decay intensified in many cities. A series of urban riots put an exclamation point on a general feeling of disorder. Many streets and parks became threatening places. Americans, whites and blacks, fled the inner city for the suburbs. Between 1950 and 1990, Chicago lost 23% of its population. Washington, 24%. Detroit, 44%. Cleveland, 45%. St. Louis lost 54% of its population. And all this happened while the total American population was growing by 64%. Surveying this urban landscape, California-born political scientist James Q. Wilson focused his attention on the effects of crime. Wilson received his Ph.D. from the University of Chicago in 1959 and later taught at Harvard and UCLA.
Between 1963 and the early 1970s, the rate of violent crime more or less tripled in the United States. By violent crime, I mean murder, manslaughter, and robbery. So we had a tripling of the crime rate at a time when the country was by and large prosperous, in which the unemployment rates, even among African American adolescents, was quite low.
It was getting harder to arrest, prosecute, convict, and incarcerate criminals. Remarkably, even though crime was up, the number of people being sent to prison went down by 12% between 1960 and 1970. Americans were outraged and wanted solutions.
One of the things we looked at is whether, if the probability of going to prison for a crime is higher in one state than another state, will the crime rate in the state where the probability of prison is higher be less than the crime rate in the state where the probability of prison is lower, other things being equal? And we learned that the answer seemed to be yes.
I think James Q. Wilson's biggest impact on the study of crime was to make the argument that it was legitimate and appropriate to think about punishing criminals. Among academics, the emphasis had for a long, long time been very heavily on trying to either deter crime on the one hand and to rehabilitate criminals so that they wouldn't commit more crimes on the other hand.
Jim Wilson made the scholarly case for what most people sensed. Putting more criminals in jail will lower the crime rate. Over time, the climate of opinion changed. Politicians began passing tougher laws. Judges handed out longer sentences. The prison population climbed dramatically. Crime rates declined, dropping more than 30% during the 1990s. It's a blessing with a downside.
You can't take as many people, particularly young men, and increasingly young women, as we have taken from some communities in our society, particularly urban communities, particularly inner city communities. You can't put that many people in prison for that long without having dramatic impacts on the whole way of life in those cities and on the way in which children are raised, for example, or not raised.
Still, increased incarceration keeps thugs off the street. The good economy and new drug rehab programs also cut crime. And Jim Wilson had another good idea.
James Q. Wilson and George Kelling developed this argument called the broken windows theory, which was that if you go into a neighborhood and you see a lot of broken windows, it tells you that nobody around here cares, that nobody's looking out for the neighborhood, that if you go break some more windows, nobody's going to do anything about it, and in some broader sense, anything goes.
It's the level of disorder that counts as much as crime. And therefore we urge the police to pay as much attention to public order, the elimination of public disorder, by getting rid of prostitutes and gangs on street corners, by painting out the graffiti, by making people feel comfortable around their homes, that this would do a lot for people and possibly, this was the theory, actually drive down the crime rate.
Police departments across the country adopted the broken windows theory. The most famous example, New York City. Subways, city parks, and other public spaces were no longer places to avoid. Crime rates declined. Most strikingly, the city's homicide rate dropped like a stone.
As it's later turned out, the research that has been done so far suggests that if you do these things, in fact, the crime rate does come down, because good people are on the streets and bad people find it hard to take advantage of them. The ability to measure the crime rate permits you to test theories, to test competing arguments to see who is correct.
In the 1970s, weak economic growth, mounting unemployment rates, and rising inflation combined to create something new, stagflation. OPEC made matters worse. The gas crunch forced Americans to sit in long lines at the pump, fuming for fumes. But changes were underway that would lead America out of its economic malaise. Case in point, airlines. Through the 1970s, the industry was heavily regulated by the Civil Aeronautics Board, which fixed prices and limited the entry of new airlines into the system. With competition thus strangled, consumers paid high prices and planes flew half empty. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it is broke, enter Alfred Kahn, a popular economics professor from Cornell University. In 1977, Jimmy Carter named Kahn the new head of the Civil Aeronautics Board. Fred Kahn told one airline official, "I really don't know one plane from the other. To me, they're all marginal costs with wings."
If I knew what was the most efficient configuration of routes into the airline system, then I could continue to regulate. But since I can't tell you whether it's going to be a Delta kind of operation, or it's going to be more like the Eastern Shuttle, which is just back and forth, or Southwest Airline, which was then just back and forth between Houston and Dallas, does it make sense to leave it to an ignorant person like me to tell airlines how they can best configure their routes?
Kahn began to clear the thicket of airline regulations. Though free market conservatives had long supported deregulation, they now had some unlikely allies.
Senator Kennedy, an old-time liberal, found himself working with the National Association of Manufacturers. It was an eye-opener that you could be an old-time liberal and consistently with that be in favor of competition, and that would be beneficial to the public.
In 1978, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act, putting the Civil Aeronautics Board out of business. The new law allowed airlines to compete in the setting of fares and routes, which also encouraged new companies to enter the market. Fred Kahn had deregulated himself out of a job and showed how deregulation could help the average consumer. Since 1978, the price of the average fare has declined nearly 40% after adjusting for inflation. In that same period, the number of airline passenger miles flown has nearly tripled.
It not only lowered prices, but it made it possible for airlines to experiment with new innovations in types of services that hugely expanded the market, so that millions of people that never traveled by airline before now do so routinely.
We have an explosion in the amount of air travel. It has meant, you may put it in a favorable way, the democratization of air travel. You may put it in an unfavorable way from a patrician standpoint. I mean, I had a complaint from a former student of mine who was very well-to-do about the hippie who was sitting next to him, unshaven, and he claimed he smelled. And I wrote back and said, well, I'm waiting to hear whether there are any complaints coming from the hippie.
That's the liberty of mobility. democratization by deregulation. Success with airlines led to deregulation of trucking, natural gas, electric power, telecommunications, banking, railroads. Deregulation of old industries and non-regulation of new ones like computers and the internet helped spur economic efficiency and growth. It provided savings for the average consumer. It set in motion what would come to be known as the new economy. Yet before that was to happen, there was one other economic problem to be solved, a big one. In the 1970s, inflation eroded the value of the dollar. A dollar in 1970 would be worth only 47 cents just 10 years later. Since incomes rarely keep up with inflation, many people became poorer just standing still.
There is something demoralizing to a country, to its people, to find that even though they get pay raises once a year, then to find for the next 364 days that the value of their money is going down and down and down. It creates a divisiveness among classes, a tendency to cast blame on villains, on profiteers, or on evil labor unions. It's divisive of society. It also promotes a feeling, sort of justifiable, that the society is out of control.
In 1978, President Carter appointed Fred Kahn to the job of so-called inflation czar, but without a czar's power. Inflation continued to rise. During a tour of a Boston food market in 1979, Kahn summed up his feelings.
Principally disappointment that the prices have taken off so badly. It's a consolation to feel that it isn't really my fault.
And ultimately, the only way of inserting the necessary discipline is monetary restraint. And I remember Paul Volcker saying to me, he said, "Fred, that program is simply not working. I'm the only one in town who has a weapon that's can be used, and sooner or later I'm going to have to use it."
In 1979, President Carter had appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Fed. Volcker, a dedicated public servant, had been a Federal Reserve economist, a Nixon Treasury official, and president of the New York Fed. At 6'7", Volcker was a giant in the world of greenbacks. But jolly, he wasn't.
Inflation is thought of as a cruel and maybe the cruelest tax because it hits in an unexpected way, in an unplanned way, and it hits the people on a fixed income hardest. And there's quite a lot of evidence, contrary to some earlier thinking, that it hits poorer people more than richer people.
Difficult times call for difficult actions. So as they say on Wall Street, Volcker slammed on the brakes.
We'll take the emphasis off of interest rates and put the emphasis on the growth in the money supply, which is at the root cause of inflation. Too much money, chasing too few goods, in the old proverbial way of putting the inflationary process. So we'll attack the too much money part of the equation. And we will stop the money supply from increasing as rapidly as it was.
So Volcker's Fed sold bonds. Less money in circulation pushed interest rates way up to 19% in 1981. That plunged America into its deepest economic downturn since the Great Depression.
I would get asked the question a lot about how can you conduct a policy that appears to throw people out of work anyway. But I also felt that in the long run, there wasn't any question that the economy was going to operate better in a context of price stability.
The recession was painful, but inflation declined from its high of 13.5% in 1980 to 1.9% in 1986 and remained low and fairly level throughout the 1990s. Since 1983, America has produced positive economic growth in 67 out of 71 quarters. This prosperous economy helped set the stock market on a vigorous bull run. Since 1981, the Dow Jones Industrial Average has increased from 875 to more than 10,000. New investors poured into the hot market, encouraged by the advent of IRAs, KEOs, and 401ks. By the end of the century, America had become a nation of owners. A majority of Americans, 52%, own stocks. Call it what you will, supercapitalism or Marxism turned on its head. Somewhat suddenly, everyday people owned a large part of the means of production. What does everyday life look like in this new economy? For that, we return to Middletown. This is Muncie, Indiana, heartland of America, and perhaps the most studied, most researched city in the world. It's an extraordinary place precisely because it's thought to be so ordinary. The sociologists have called it Middletown. What a handsome young man. Back in 1982, I visited Muncie to examine how the city had changed. I returned in 1999 to get a flavor of what was going on at the end of the century. But flavor is no match for data. So the First Measured Century commissioned a team of veteran sociologists to work on a new Middletown study.
Sorry to keep you waiting.
As the Linds had 75 years earlier, our researchers surveyed Muncie high school students and housewives.
The information will be of value in helping educators, social scientists, and people interested in the community to understand the changing needs and problems which we face.
No, that's right. They're not changed. But because before you tabulate the data, you don't know anything.
Theodore Kaplow headed the team. Howard Barr was the chief of field research.
So it may well be that this time the message will be some continuity and some significant change.
Pouring through the data, we found that plenty had changed, beginning with the nature of the economy itself. Muncie had always been a factory town, but by the 1970s, as in much of the industrial heartland, that was changing with both a vengeance and a silver lining. In 1982, Muncie's unemployment rate had soared to 18%.
What was happening was that the heavy industry, sort of basic manufacturing industry on which Middletown had always depended, was being phased out. A number of the local plants never recovered. Some of them staggered on for some years. The Ball Glass Jar Company moved away. Indiana Wire and Steel, and the packing houses shut down. The Delco reduced its workforce and eventually shut down.
America was changing, and so was Muncie. What replaced jars and cars? Ball State University and Ball Memorial Hospital, the two largest employers in Muncie in the year 2000. In the new Muncie, unemployment declined to 3%.
Muncie of 1999 is no longer a blue-collar community. It's no longer primarily an industrial community. It's a college town. It's a town where service industry, as in the rest of America, has grown to become one of the major sources of income.
What else has changed in Muncie? The structure of the family, just as in the rest of America. In 1924, the Linds found that nearly all Muncie children grew up with both natural parents. By 1977, that number dropped to 68% and kept falling.
1999, only half of the Middletown High School students could report that they lived in an intact family. 1/5, 18%, lived with mom, alone. Another 1/5 lived in step-parent families.
As in the rest of America, more women in Muncie are working. So it comes as little surprise that women there spend less time keeping house. In 1924, 87% of married women in Muncie averaged 4 or more hours a day of housework. That figure had dropped to 43% in 1977, and by 1999, all the way down to 14%.
Doing the laundry for a family might consume 2.5 woman days in 1924. And the same is true of cooking, food preparation, cleaning. In all respects, housework has been drastically simplified, and that is why women are now able, at the same time that they are effectively compelled, to join the labor force.
Women are spending more time at the job and less time doing housework. But does all this add up to an erosion of the family?
One of the results that looks paradoxical here, because everybody knows about the great pressure that women have in reconciling their work role and their roles as wives and mothers, and we find that they spend more time with their children, and so do fathers, than they did in 1977, and much more time than they did in 1924.
The Linds found that 45% of Muncie mothers spent more than 2 hours a day with their children. By 1977, that number had risen to 65%, and our researchers found that in 1999, it had gone up to 71%. Regarding religion in Muncie, our research found both continuity and change. Some data show that the importance of religion has declined.
The Linds gave a list of a dozen or so characteristics and asked parents to pick the ones that they thought were most important. And the ones that came up in 1924 were that their children be good churchgoers, that they have religion, and that they learn strict obedience. By 99, the characteristics that parents in Middletown are most keen to impart to their children, even though obedience would help them, are that the kids be tolerant and that they be independent.
Still, religious faith continued to play a strong role in family life.
You have those indications of continuity in religious belief. You have the church attendance, which if anything is a little higher in 77 and the 90s than it is in 1924.
Let's listen to some responses to an open-ended survey question. What do you think about when you're in trouble? Where do you turn to?
I go to church because I want my children to know there is a God. I'm a true believer of God, but I don't go often enough to church. I go to church because it's an important influence for us and the children. We need anchors in life. It's a very comfortable, friendly congregation, a great minister.
Middletown is social science at a micro level. The U.S. Census is macro, very macro. It is taken every 10 years and counts all Americans. This machine, the first mechanical calculator, was invented for use in the census of 1890. Its inventor, Herman Hollerith, a census employee, later helped create a little startup, IBM. Today, the modern descendants of this device are pumping detailed data into the bloodstream of American life. It is hard to imagine how the nation could manage itself without such measurements.
I think the rudiments of democratic accountability, not just democratic governance, but democratic accountability, depend upon a healthy, vibrant, high-quality national statistical system. How in the world can you govern a complicated industrial economy without decent information by those people who have to write the laws and administer the laws and the programs?
Ken Pruitt has spent much of his career gathering and examining data. His biggest task as a social scientist came as director of Census 2000, the keystone document in America's statistical system. What does the census tell us about America at the dawn of the 21st century? Here's a grab bag. Fewer men are working past age 65, helping trigger a boom in retirement housing and travel. Life expectancy for both men and women at age 60 has gone up substantially.
One of the most extraordinary changes in demography and people living longer that has been overlooked is not only are people living longer physically, but they're retaining their vitality for a longer period of time. Today's 79-year-old person is the equivalent of 65-year-old person earlier in the century.
Income inequality has been a controversial issue at the end of the century. On its face, it appears that the wealthiest 5% of families not only earned more money than the bottom 40%, but that recently their share of income rose dramatically before leveling off. But there is more to the story. There has been a stunning rise in the average income of middle-class Americans over the century. Moreover, the fruits of modernization have been shared across the board. Most Americans, regardless of income, get the same pharmaceuticals, watch the same movies and videos, have the same mode of personal transportation, and share the same internet.
By any measures, whether we're looking at money income or broader measures of good health, the wealth that people have accumulated, how much money they spend, how they spend their time, that there has been a spectacular equalization of real life circumstances over the past century. One of the reasons that redistribution has receded from our politics is that the material necessities of life, and even things that were until fairly recently considered the material luxuries of life, have become so ubiquitous.
The South grew most economically. In 1900, Southerners earned about half the national average. By century's end, correcting for cost of living, the South caught up to the rest of the country. One hero, air conditioning, now universal in the South. And of course, America grew from 76 million people in 1900 to 275 million in 2000. Grown and become more diverse, due mostly to the Immigration Act of 1965.
In 1965, there was a sea change in American immigration law. The country abandoned the national origins quota system and adopted a system which stressed family reunification, the admission of immigrants who offered something to the United States professionally or in terms of badly needed skills. We no longer wanted to restrict immigration from particular countries the way we had in the earlier period.
Now, it's not Europe. Now it is the rest of the world. It is Southeast Asia, the Far East. It is a new diaspora from Africa. It's Somalians, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Senegalese. It is, of course, a huge movement from Latin America.
Between 1900 and 1930, 98% of all immigrants came from Europe. Between 1965 and 1995, it was 15%. The effects of this change are apparent. Asian Americans have increased from 0.2% of the population in 1950 to 4% in 2000. The Hispanic population went up from 3% to 11%. The black proportion of the population grew moderately from 10% to 13%. Back in 1950, 88% of Americans were classified as non-Hispanic whites. The 2000 census shows that figure at about 70%, and the Census Bureau projects that this so-called Anglo population will make up 53% by 2050. In 1982, pollsters asked whether specific immigrant groups have been good or bad for America. Most respondents thought English immigrants had been a good influence. But look at this. Italians, Jews, and Poles, once scorned, also had very high approval ratings. And what do Americans think of more recent immigrants? The same 1982 poll showed dramatically less approval. Yet by 1997, positive images of Haitian, Vietnamese, Korean, and Mexican immigrants had climbed substantially.
The American public tends to look at immigration with rose-colored glasses turned backwards. By that I mean that they tend to see immigrants who arrived earlier, whenever earlier happens to be, as those who make positive contributions to this country, as those who have helped build this country, settle the land, and so forth, and immigrants who are coming now. And the now could have been 50 years ago, it could be today, as immigrants who are not likely to make positive contributions and whose admittance should be severely limited.
So is the old melting pot still simmering? It is demographically. Among Asian Americans, 64% marry outside their ethnic group. Among Hispanic Americans, 37% marry outside their ethnic group. The African American rate is much lower, but rising from 3% in 1980 to 8.8% in 1998, and higher for younger persons. If these rates of intermarriage continue to grow, racial and ethnic classifications will likely have less meaning in the future.
It's called sometimes the Tiger Woods phenomena. Tiger Woods, after all, would presumably tick 4 boxes. Asian, Native American Indian, white, and black. He sees himself as coming from all 4 of those racial traditions, and he so said so. So he would be 4 categories.
Intermarriage and assimilation can often be painful and resisted. But remember what Israel Zangwill wrote. America is God's crucible, the great melting pot. God is making the American. It seems to be happening.
So we now are creating a country, the first country in world history, which literally has to represent all of the world. Which is to say, it's not just Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish. It's now Hindu, Buddhist, and Muslim, along with Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. It's not just 4 or 5 languages, it's 150 languages. We have the challenge and the opportunity to create the first country in world history which literally is a reflection of the entire world. If we do that well, it will be an enormous accomplishment.
America is indeed becoming the first universal nation. I think it will work out well. And measurably, liberty has been extended in a most exceptional land. Deep in their bones, despite the media drumbeat of crisis and scandal, Americans know this to be true. In 1999, pollsters were in the field asking this question: is America a unique country that stands for something special in the world? By 84% to 13%, Americans said yes. Another poll asked, why was America successful during the 20th century? The top 3 responses: our Constitution, free elections, and the free enterprise system. What next? Living in liberty doesn't mean there are no problems, only that we have imperfect ways of dealing with problems. With the social science tools developed in the century just past, we can better measure what's happening and why it's happening. This bolsters the American tradition of liberty, allowing us to better respond and adapt to change imperfectly. It's not everything, but if you look around the world, it's not nothing either. It's about as good as it gets. I encourage you to take a look at the numbers for yourself on the web and in reference books. Shape them, sculpt them, massage them as you will. Let me know what you find out. For the First Measured Century and for Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1219 Connecticut Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about the First Measured Century, visit PBS online at pbs.org. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content. The First Measured Century is made possible by T. Rowe Price Associates. For over 60 years, T. Rowe Price has been committed to helping independent investors make informed decisions and achieve their financial goals. T. Rowe Price. Invest with confidence. T. Rowe Price Investment Services, Incorporated.
We're Pfizer. We're looking for the cures of the future. Spending about $4.5 billion a year in search of new medicines for the 21st century. Pfizer. Life is our life's work.
The Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation. The Bernard and Irene Schwartz Foundation. The John M. Olin Foundation. The Smith Richardson Foundation. The D&D Foundation. By the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.